Hello and welcome to our short video explaining about the organisation and function of the cerebral cortex in motor control. So to start with, we know that we have our white matter and our grey matter of our central nervous system. Within the spinal cord, the white matter is around the outside and surrounds the grey matter, which is towards the midline. That changes a little bit when we get through the brainstem, where we have a bit more of the grey matter sort of drifting towards the outer layers, but it's kind of interspersed with white matter. It's a lot more complex. Once we get to the cerebral hemispheres, however, the grey matter is actually on the outside. Now, what is the grey matter compared to the white matter? Remembering that the grey matter is the cell bodies of neurons. So that's where the communication is occurring between one neuron and another, whereas the white matter is the highways, is the communication highways between different grey matter sections. And so within the cerebral hemispheres, our cerebral cortex is of real importance, and we want to have a bit of a delve into that cerebral cortex proper. When we talk about the cerebral cortex, there's two locations that are very important to motor control. So we have a central sulcus here that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and if we go anterior or rostral to that central sulcus, we have what's called the precentral gyrus. That precentral gyrus is known as the motor homunculus, or the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. Homunculus simply means little man. And the reason why we call it homunculus is because each location is kind of a map of the human body across that surface in the cortex. So upper motor neurons or motor commands for the face come from this particular region, the hands from here, and so on. And so it's a map of a little man. Now that's the precentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus in blue here on both sides is our somatosensory homunculus, or our primary somatosensory cortex. And so any sensation coming from the periphery or the body comes up and ends up communicating in this homunculus, and again it's mapped. So if you have an itch on your face, or you're feeling a tickle on your foot, it goes to a particular location within that somatosensory cortex. Very important in the control of actions, because what we're talking about is the sensation and then the motor commands. And as we know from week 1, module 1, sensory impressions have a huge impact on motor output, and motor output then causes sensory impressions, that action perception coupling that goes on. Now, not only do we have this primary motor cortex and our primary somatosensory cortex, we have other primary sensory areas, such as our primary auditory cortex that's on our temporal lobe here, right near our Sylvian fissure. We also have our primary visual cortex at the occipital lobe, right at the back of the head. So if you ever get hit in the back of the head, you go dizzy, it's because you've disrupted the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex. So we have these primary areas, and primary simply means that either we have the primary processing of first sensory information coming into the central nervous system, in particular the cortex, or in the case of a motor, the primary motor cortex is the final descending command comes from there. That goes down to the spinal cord and out to the muscles. Not only do we have our primary areas that we can see here now in the bottom in purple, all the primary areas, either sensory or motor, are indicated in that purple colour. We have what's called unimodal association cortex areas, and that's these red or pinky parts. And so we have our primary somatosensory cortex, but just posterior to that, or caudal is a term in neurology, is the association, the somatosensory association cortex. And so what we have is the primary area processing the sensory information that comes in, firstly, to make more sense or a greater understanding of that sensory impression, we process back through the somatosensory association cortex. If we need to prepare our actions, we prepare them in our supplementary motor and premotor areas, and that's just anterior or rostral to our primary motor cortex. So we prepare the actions in here. They go into the primary motor cortex to then go down. So any of this unimodal association cortex areas is basically processing one type of sensory information or motor information and passing that, and it's received that from a sensory area or is passing it on to the primary motor area. This area down here is our visual processing, our ventral stream. Talk more about that later in the term. Then we also have what we call heteromodal association cortex areas. Heteromodal are very complex areas that are now mixing different sensory and motor modes. So this heteromodal area here at the parietal occipital junction and also the occipital temporal junction, that's where we're mixing auditory information in with visual information in with somatosensory information. So what we're doing is essentially creating sort of like a 3D sensory understanding of ourselves. Our prefrontal cortex is the thing that sets us apart as humans, and that's where all that complex calculation, decision making, emotional processing, that kind of stuff occurs in this prefrontal association areas, and it receives inputs from all sensory primary and unimodal association cortical areas to help with judgment and mood and all those sorts of things. So that there in a nutshell is a quick explanation of our cerebral cortex and its function in motor control. So thanks for listening, and talk to you soon.